On August 21st, 2018, Naomi H. tweeted, "Everyone shut the f*** up. I got accepted for a NASA internship." Homer Hickam replied, "Language." Naomi H. responded, "Suck my dick and balls, I'm working at NASA." And Homer replied, "And I am on the National Space Council, which oversees NASA." This is the Museum of Twitter, the show we talk about the most important tweets in the history of Twitter.com. It's Subscriber Sunday, when my Patreon subscribers get to choose what I cover, and they chose this classic interaction. This might be the most famous example of someone on Twitter not knowing who they're talking to and getting into some trouble for it. Because yeah, people use foul language on Twitter all the time, they tell people to suck their dick and balls on Twitter all the time, but usually they're not talking to someone who is very important in the industry and specifically the company that they're going to work for. I will say that there are a lot of misconceptions about this story, and I think that this was covered much better than I ever could cover it by Jamie Loftus on her show 16th Minute of Fame, where she actually spoke to Naomi H. for an extensive interview. I'll be referencing that a good bit because it's really informative, but I actually think if you're interested in this, you should listen to the whole episode. So after this interaction, a lot of people reported on it, and what they reported is that Naomi actually lost her internship at NASA because of it. And it is true that Naomi did lose her internship. NASA didn't give a super clear response, but they did say that it was actually in part because of the harassment that Homer Hickam got after this whole interaction from Naomi's friends and fans or whatever. I don't know if I should trust that, but it is a thing that they said. Now for his part, Homer did not actually have anything to do with Naomi getting fired. He actually reached out to NASA and tried to get them to undo the firing when she got fired. So I think it's very fair to say that Homer is not the villain in this story. I also think it's fun to point out that Homer Hickam is actually the guy that Jake Gyllenhaal plays in the movie October Sky, so there's that. Now what I learned from Jamie Loftus' interview with Naomi is that Naomi actually does now work in the aerospace industry, not at NASA, but she does work in that industry, she has a good job, so this story does not have an unhappy ending. But one thing that was very unhappy is that she mentioned that she got the email saying that her internship was revoked when she was getting ready for her brother's wedding. So she had to spend her brother's wedding telling all the family members that had previously learned that she was going to be interning at NASA, hey, no, I'm not actually going to be doing that because of a tweet I sent. And that's awful. Now, when this all happened, there was a big divide among people who thought that she either should or should not have gotten fired. Like, Hugs mocked the idea that people thought that it was an abuse of power to fire her. Yet Gale, all the way in 2022, maintained that it was not a fireable offense. America Offline's issue was that NASA had hired someone who didn't know who Homer Hickam was. It's like, yeah, but it's not like they were hiring her to be the intern in the history department. My personal opinion is that she definitely should have gotten a phone call and a talking to about the social media policy, but since she was not a public-facing employee, and her account was anonymous enough where people don't really know her full name and information, I don't think it was a fireable offense. But I'm also not going to lose my mind over it necessarily. Now, what makes this all loaded, and I think is a thing that is often not remarked upon when people talk about the controversy, is that a lot of the backlash to it was because Naomi is a trans woman and a furry. I don't think I need to say that trans people get an undue amount of harassment on the internet, and so a lot of the worst parts of the internet picked up on this and were mocking the fact that a trans woman was in this situation, and mocking the fact that a furry was in this situation, and obviously I think furries are considered a more fertile target for average people than trans people are. I don't think this has anything to do with her getting fired, but I think that it is important to note when talking about the backlash and the staying power that this has had, especially among people who want to criticize Naomi. I will say, I do think it's a cautionary tale, because I think that people too often don't treat the internet like it's real life. And obviously it's not the same as real life, but especially if you're talking about real things going on in your life, you do need to be somewhat responsible with how you talk about them. I'm not saying that you need to only post things that you would be okay with your employer reading, but I do think you need to think like, wait, if my employer read this, would they have grounds for firing me? And I think that this is applicable here because I think if Naomi had just told someone to suck her dick and balls in any other context, I think it would probably be fine. But because it's in the context of, one, she's saying it to someone who works with NASA, and two, it's about NASA in the internship she got, I think that that gives NASA more of a reason to fire her. I think I've said this about a couple tweets recently, but just put in a little bit of thought before you hit post. The worst thing that can happen if you do is that you might post something 5 seconds later than you usually would, and the worst thing that can happen if you don't put in any thought is, this. Follow me for a new tweet every day and consider subscribing at patreon.com/Museum of Twitter, where you can do things like vote on what I cover on Subscriber Sunday, you get the weekly Museum of Not Twitter, and you get access to my Discord.